All right, everybody. So if you are watching this video, you've already pulled up this agenda, I know, because you had to click the link up here this morning. So as you can see in the agenda today, the first thing that we're going to do is review civil disobedience. And I actually put together a key that's linked in the agenda today, which I'm going to go through with you right now. But if you are interested, you can always make a copy of this and save it to your files yourself, because eventually we're going to have an open note test, a remote test over this whole unit on transcendentalism and the dark romantics, right? So it may, again, benefit you to go file, make a copy, and make your own copy of this key so that you can use it on the test in a week or so. Okay, so let's talk about civil disobedience here. You can check your answers by pulling up your electronic copy if you worked on it. If you're someone who had a physical copy that you turned in class, maybe you stopped by my classroom on Friday to get it. If not, you could just pull up the assignment in Google Classroom where it's posted and go through these different sections as I do. We already talked about this first section in class, so I'm going to skip over that. The second paragraph, and again, when you're looking at your summaries and you're comparing them to mine, yours are going to look different, right? You're going to use different word choice. We have different brains. But what I'm focused on here is you got the main ideas from each paragraph. Okay, so this second section, what I said was, although Thoreau is in jail after not paying his poll tax for 6 years, he feels more free than his neighbors and his peers due to his mindset and his understanding of the government. And that's something you can see clearly in these two paradoxes here. He says, I saw that if there was a wall of stone between me and my townsmen, there was still a more difficult one to climb or break through before they could get to be as free as I was. And so in that paradox, again, we talked about paradoxes last week, contradictory statements that actually hold some truth. In that paradox, he's saying even though he's physically in prison, he feels more free than his townspeople because he truly knows what the government's doing, how corrupt it is, and how it functions. He also uses a paradox here that's important in this paragraph when he says, I felt as if I alone of all my townsmen had paid my tax. We know he didn't literally pay his tax. That's why he's in jail in the first place. But what do you pay taxes for? When you go shopping, you pay taxes, and those taxes are pooled into a thing of money that goes back to public schools, roads in your community. It goes back to your community, right? So that's what a tax does. It's money that you pay to help others in your community and to help your community as a whole. Thoreau's saying even though he didn't pay his tax through money like most people, he paid his tax by spending a night in prison and standing up for the rights of all people. Okay? So that's what's going on in that second section there. The third section, I said jail allows Thoreau to see the intricacies of the town and who people truly are. He says at the end of that paragraph, right, I began to comprehend or understand what the town's inhabitants were about. So in reflecting on his stay in jail, he learns a lot about his community and the people in it. The next section, I said Thoreau sees how the government functions and how many of his neighbors are only supportive of him when things are positive. This is highlighted in this phrase here when he says their friendship, his neighbors and the townspeople's friendship, was for summer weather only. We have a phrase we use for that today, fair weather friends, people who are only with you in the good times. You may have heard fair weather fans, fans of sports teams who are only fans when the teams are doing well. That's the type of people he's talking about here. So that's that section. This next section is probably the most important one. It's the actual conclusion of the essay. And he says, our democracy cannot be the last step here. Our government can be improved through more participation by its citizens every day. Okay? And again, that's probably the most important part of Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. He's not advocating for anarchy, for bloodshed, for completely overthrowing the government. He's saying that we have a strong government, we have a democracy, it's representative of a lot of citizens and a lot of voices, but we can always do a better job. We can improve upon that government in many ways through more citizen participation. And that's the main thesis, the main idea behind his essay again. Our government cannot be the last step. Our government can be improved through more participation by everyday citizens. Okay, so this next section, part 2, I'm going to quickly go over the answers that I had for these discussion questions. We already talked about this paradox, right? He says even though Thoreau's physically in prison, he feels more free than his peers because of his mindset and his understanding of the government and how it can oppress its citizens. When he says, I felt as if I alone of all my townsmen had paid my tax, I said, although Thoreau did not literally pay his tax, which is why he's in jail, he feels he paid his tax by standing up for what's right, so his society could benefit, which is the goal of any tax, again. How are his perceptions of his fellow townsmen changed? If you were paying attention to this video, we just talked about that, so I'm not going to go over that. And what traces of Emerson's thought can you find in Thoreau's essay? Remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson is the founding father of transcendentalism we talked about last week. And Thoreau was his student. Emerson was Thoreau's mentor. And so you can clearly see, hopefully, in this essay that Thoreau is self-reliant, right? He's independent. He is not conforming to the rest of society's expectations of normal behavior. He trusts his gut, he trusts his first instinct, and he stands up for what's right, okay? All right, then you read this letter from a Birmingham jail. Again, this was a letter that was written over 100 years after civil disobedience, but it's a very similar situation. Martin Luther King Jr. spends a night in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, after protesting segregation during the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. He writes this letter after his experience in jail. And so I asked for the main idea, his thesis, his purpose, and his tone. Remember, Matt is your friend. Matt helps you simplify complex nonfiction like the stuff I'm asking you to read. So his main idea you should have picked up on, again, just like I talked about with Thoreau's essay, you don't necessarily need to have this stuff word for word, but if you picked up on these ideas, you were in the right spot with your comprehension. So his main idea is that we have laws in America. Some laws are just, some laws are unjust. Unjust laws are ones that oppress minorities, and they pose injustice to groups of people. And those are the laws we need to be fighting or protesting. There are just laws. There are laws that should be obeyed and benefit society, but it's the unjust ones that we need to stand up to and protest. Okay? His purpose, you could have a variety of verbs here, but he's trying to persuade and inform readers of the best practices when it comes to protesting and standing up for one's rights. Basically, he's saying, hey, we can't go about protesting every single thing, every single law. We need to protest the unjust ones and focus on those important ones. His tone is persuasive, informative, assertive, whatever you wanted to say there. You can just take your verb here. If you said he was persuading, well, then his tone's persuasive. If you said he was informing, well, then his tone's informative, right? Okay. And then you all had a Venn diagram that maybe you completed if you were in-person learning that I'm sure we talked about in various ways throughout our discussion in this video. All right, so that's civil disobedience and letter from a Birmingham jail. We're going to move on today, as you can see here in the agenda. Your assignment for today is to read chapter 1 of a book called Into the Wild and answer the chapter 1 questions that were posted in a study guide this morning. You can work directly from that study guide electronically. If you're someone who's been in person and you weren't absent on Thursday or Friday during your in-person class, you also received a physical copy of that study guide. Remember, you can work physically and take pictures and upload them to the assignment that posted this morning as well. However you want to do things, okay? But the chapter 1 questions, there's 5 questions, are due by 8:30 tomorrow. So you need to have those answered in that electronic study guide or through your picture that you upload. You can hit turn in. If you hit turn in, I'll return it to you. But as long as you do that by 8:30 tomorrow, I should be able to see your work on that assignment that posted this morning. The link to Into the Wild is right here. So you can click that from the agenda like I'm going to do right now. Again, though, if you were in person, if you were a B student who was here on Thursday or an A student who was here on Friday, you received this packet of Into the Wild, right? You have this packet somewhere. So you can read from this too. You don't have to read from a computer screen if you don't want to. You can see here that Into the Wild is a book. I just gave you the first 3 chapters, a portion of it, that we're going to read over the next few days. It starts with an author's note, and I'm actually going to read that to you right now to give you some context, to give you some background information that you need before you start reading the book. So we're going to go through this on this video. If you want to have your copy pulled up in front of you while I read, that would probably be the best way to do this. and then you can jot down some notes on what I say as I read. So you're going to read chapter 1 on your own. That's right here. It's called the Alaska Interior. It's only a few pages, and then you're going to answer 5 questions by tomorrow. Chapter 2 comes after it. You don't have to read anything from chapter 2 yet. That'll be tomorrow's assignment. Okay? So I'm going to pull this up here, and we're going to do a little reading virtually today. Okay. In April 1992, a young man from a well-to-do East Coast family hitchhiked to Alaska and walked alone into the wilderness north of Mount McKinley. 4 months later, his decomposed body was found by a party of moose hunters. Shortly after the discovery of the corpse, I was asked by the editor of Outside magazine to report on the puzzling circumstances of the boy's death. His name turned out to be Christopher Johnson McCandless, and he'd grown up, I learned, in an affluent means wealthy, suburb of Washington, D.C., where he'd excelled academically and been an elite athlete. So he had a lot going for him, right? He grew up in a well-to-do family, and he was a good student, good athlete. Which begs the question, why is this book starting like this? How did this young man get into this situation where he died alone in the wilderness? Well, we're about to find out. The author, by the way, is a guy named John Krakauer, and that's who the I refers to. John Krakauer, the author, is writing this author's note. Okay. Immediately after graduating with honors from Emory University, that's a good school in Georgia, in summer of 1990, McCandless dropped out of sight. He changed his name, gave the entire balance of a $24,000 savings account, that's a lot of money, to charity, abandoned his car and most of his possessions, burned all the cash in his wallet, and then he invented a new life for himself, taking up residence at the ragged margin of our society, wandering across North America in search of raw, transcendent experience. So that should tell you a little bit why we're reading this right now. Even though this takes place in the 90s and is much more modern than transcendentalism, this has to do a lot with our current unit. His family had no idea where he was or what had become of him until his remains turned up in Alaska. Working on a tight deadline, I wrote a 9,000-word article, which ran in the January 1993 issue of the magazine. But my fascination with McCandless remained long after that issue of Outside was replaced on the newsstands by more current journalistic fare. I was haunted by the particulars of the boy's starvation and by vague, unsettling parallels between events in his life and those in my own. Unwilling to let McCandless go, I spent more than a year retracing the convoluted path that led to his death in the Alaska taiga, it's a wilderness, chasing down details of his peregrinations with an interest that bordered on obsession. In trying to understand McCandless, I inevitably came to reflect on other, larger subjects as well. So these are some themes that the book touches on. The grip wilderness has on the American imagination, the allure high-risk activities hold for young men of a certain mind, the complicated, highly charged bond that exists between fathers and sons. The result of this meandering inquiry is the book now before you. I won't claim to be an impartial biographer. McCandless's strange tale struck a personal note that made a dispassionate rendering of the tragedy impossible. Through most of the book, I have tried and largely succeeded, I think, to minimize my authorial presence. But let the reader be warned, I interrupt McCandless's story with fragments of a narrative that's just a story drawn from my own youth. I do so in the hope that my experiences will throw some oblique light on the enigma that's a riddle of Chris McCandless. I'm going to give you an answer on your study guide right now. If you're paying attention still, a little reward for you. This whole paragraph here, the author is telling us, John Krakauer is telling us there's going to be some bias involved in this book. Okay, he's saying, hey, I'm going to interrupt this story of Chris McCandless with my own thoughts and opinions in my own life. He was an extremely intense young man and possessed a streak of stubborn idealism that did not mesh readily with modern existence. Long captivated by the writing of Leo Tolstoy, McCandless particularly admired how the great novelist had forsaken a life of wealth and privilege to wander among the destitute. In college, McCandless began emulating Tolstoy's asceticism. That means like living off of bare minimums, nothing else. And moral rigor to a degree that first astonished, then alarmed those who were close to him. When the boy headed off into the Alaska bush, he entertained no illusions that he was trekking into a land of milk and honey. Peril, adversity, tough times, and Tolstoyan renunciation were precisely what he was seeking, and that is what he found in abundance. For most of the 16-week ordeal, nevertheless, McCandless more than held his own. Indeed, were it not for one or two seemingly insignificant blunders, those are mistakes, he would have walked out of the woods in August 1992 as anonymously as he had walked into them in April. Instead, his innocent mistakes turned out to be pivotal and irreversible. His name became the stuff of tabloid headlines, and his bewildered family was left clutching the shards of a fierce and painful love. A surprising number of people have been affected by the story of Chris McCandless's life and death. In the weeks and months following the publication of the article in Outside, it generated more mail than any other article in the magazine's history. The correspondence, as one might expect, reflected sharply divergent points of view. Some readers admired the boy immensely for his courage and noble ideals. Others fulminated that he was a reckless idiot, a wacko, a narcissist who perished out of arrogance and stupidity, and was undeserving of the considerable media attention he received. My conviction should be apparent soon enough, but I will leave it to the reader to form his or her own opinion of Chris McCandless. From John Krakauer, again, that's the author. He wrote that in Seattle in 1995 when the book was originally written. Okay, so that's all I'm reading with you today. You're on your own for Chapter 1, the Alaska Interior, which jumps right into this young man's story. And again, just one last reminder, if you are reading electronically, then you can click right here. You just had that pulled up, hopefully, as I read and took some notes. You need to finish reading Chapter 1 and the 5 questions on the study guide that posted this morning in Classroom by 8:30 tomorrow. I'll be checking those responses tomorrow to check in on you guys, see how you did with this, and then we will go from there. You'll have some more reading from me tomorrow from Into the Wild. Hope everyone's doing all right on this first day back with remote learning. Don't hesitate to get in touch. If you don't have any questions for me. Have a good day.